In the mid-1800s in the United States, a culture of lyceums flourished. Public lyceums were places where people could gather for adult education. They hosted classes, debates, and talks by noted intellectuals. Speakers would travel the lyceum circuit, giving public lectures in one city after another. This was also a time when science was becoming more formalized as a profession, and innovations in physics and biology were transforming our understanding of the world. These lecture circuits became an important way for people to learn about those discoveries. Scientists would give public talks featuring live experiments, visual aids, and careful elocution. British scientists would also make the trip to America to give talks. And these were popular affairs. These lectures became a nationwide phenomenon, calling on agents, news reporters, and civic organizations to meet public demand. And these speakers made a mark. One religious magazine reported on a lecture on light by Professor John Tyndall, writing that his extreme lucidity of style never fails to carry the audience completely with him, and that his lectures would do much to stimulate and foster science in America. Stenographers and journalists would record public science lectures and print them on the front page of newspapers. The public was interested in science. Of course, it wasn't all roses. Intentionally or not, these lectures could also spark local controversy, especially when they challenged popular religious views at the time. This was an age when several science lecturers were sharing new ideas about evolution. But even then, the public seemed ravenous to learn what these speakers had to say. So in 18th century America, you could be a star for sharing the science of the day. The public was in. But what's the state of public opinion on science today? You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. I'm Andy Luttrell, and today I'm excited to introduce my friend Aviva Philipp-Muller. She and I overlapped a bit in grad school, and these days she's an assistant professor of marketing at the Beedie School of Business at Simon Fraser University. One of the things she's interested in is people's tendencies to reject science, or at least keep some distance from it. We'll talk about some of her research on people's openness to the use of science in consumer products and how they're marketed, and she also talks about her perspective on how we could understand public anti-science views as an issue of persuasion. So let's get into it. It's funny, when I was reading the one paper, I was thinking some of this is familiar. And I remembered that one of my first meetings with Rich in grad school, truly within the first month or two, was I was interested in science education and science communication in college.
Oh.
And I came in and I was had all these ideas about attitudes towards science and I pulled up I dug this up. I didn't know I still had it in my Gmail, but the proposal I wrote for the NSF grad student fellowship program that we had to apply to. And the opening paragraph was all about implications of certainty for communication in science education, because people are resistant to science messaging. And I was like, wait a second, this is quite a bit before you wrote this paper, but very much along the same lines. So I'm curious, why study what the public thinks about science?
Well, I think there are a number of large and salient examples that are in our environment, in our world right now, of people and communities really rejecting science, being resistant to science. And so we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, when scientists would give certain recommendations, there was often huge backlash. Or with climate change, scientists, oftentimes there's a large backlash against any type of recommendation that a climate change scientist provides. And those are just two examples. There's obviously a lot of other types of science that are practiced and that have received backlash. And so I'd say that 2020 was probably a year where this program of research kind of ramped up for me, where it became all the more interesting and exciting to look at.
What was it? Were there seeds of it before then, though?
Yes, yeah. So I started the Get Your Science Out of Here paper looking at sort of consumer responses to scientifically formulated or marketed products. That I started well before the pandemic. And it was something that I was interested in among lots of other topics. I think what initially attracted me to that topic was seeing ads that felt kind of weird to me and just didn't quite sit right. And I imagined, I bet you if I feel weird about this, other consumers might also feel weird about it. And so there wasn't any inkling of, this is a broader societal issue. It was more just, why do brands put out these ads that talk about the scientific formulation of a product, and when does that work and when does it not work?
Maybe we can start there, actually. So, can you give me an example of what do you mean that ads are talking about science?
So I'll give an example of a Cadbury ad that talks about their chocolate products, and chocolate is, generally seen as a really indulgent, pleasurable product. And Cadbury often highlights scientists that are working on their products. And there's this one notable ad where it's a commercial and they show, a chocolate scientist, I suppose, in a lab, wearing a lab coat, using a centrifuge to mix together different aspects of the chocolate ingredients. And it's sort of dramatized, of course, for the commercial, but it's the central focus of the commercial is on a scientist creating chocolate to be, I suppose, the optimal chocolate bar. And there are a lot of other examples, of course, of products, of ads and commercials where the sort of central feature that's being highlighted is how it's been scientifically formulated or scientifically developed.
Do you remember the ad that you is that this ad you saw that sparked the idea, this Cadbury ad?
Yeah.
What was weird to it? What about that made you go like, this is, I wonder if other people are as upset by this as I am?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say I wasn't horrifically disturbed.
Oh, we could play it up. You were horrified.
I was distraught. I think what struck me as odd was that, the idea of a chocolate scientist in the first place, and the idea that was the sort of central thing that was being focused on seemed weird, because I don't know how many people care about whether their chocolate bar is optimally created. And then, of course, conducting the research project, we found evidence that people don't want their chocolate bars to be optimally created, or at least they don't want sort of their indulgent food products to be scientifically formulated and optimized. So I think there's a time and place for talking about science, and maybe chocolate just isn't one of them.
So beyond the chocolate, not chocolate divide, what is it ultimately? What is the class of advertisements for which people are not super compelled by a science message versus a class of ads where that's actually a true benefit?
What we found in our research was that when a product is designed to serve a hedonic, meaning an indulgent goal, when the product is supposed to sort of make you feel warm and fuzzy, like a chocolate bar or a chocolate chip cookie, or beyond the food domain, something like an indulgent body wash or a lotion, that's where we found that talking about the product being scientifically formulated backfired, and consumers really didn't like it. They felt like, hold on a second, science is this cold, sterile thing, and you're telling me that my indulgent, sensual body wash was scientifically formulated? That feels off and weird. On the other hand, there are other types of products where people do want science to be involved, thankfully, and say, I actually would rather this product be scientifically formulated. And that is for products that serve more of a functional purpose. So if the product is really practical, like, let's say, not an indulgent body wash, but a body wash that's designed to wash away odor-causing bacteria, or not a sensual, rich, cushiony lotion, but a lotion for eczema. That's where people actually do want science to be involved and would rather there be scientific involvement and that the product be scientifically formulated than not.
So it seems like the critical thing is just feeling that science, my conception of science matches the sorts of things that I get practical utility from, right? Both of those are sort of cold, just like well-articulated and well-formulated things. And that I just get this weird, you put it as the feeling of offness. Like, do you measure that? Do you ask people like what's wrong here? Or is it just we infer that like you keep saying that you don't like this product as much when we tell you about the science behind it? Or do we know something like very particularly like why? Can they tell you why this doesn't feel right?
Well, we did measure as you put it, the feeling of offness. And it did seem to be the case that when that scientific formulation for these indulgent products felt off, felt disconnected. The word that we used was that it felt disfluent. So it just felt like there's a disconnect between how I think about this type of product and how you're describing it to me. Whereas when the product serves a more practical, functional purpose, it's perfectly fluent for science to be involved, and it doesn't feel off. It feels conceptually like a good fit.
So it is more of like a vague sense of just like, I get good vibes from this or I get bad, as opposed to like a logical inference of like, therefore, this product must be good. It's just like, this doesn't feel right to me. That
it was a vibe check,
yeah,
yes.
that they're sciencing up this lotion.
Yeah, I think I don't think it was a logical inference that they were making. I think it was more of a general sense of this feels not right. And the questions that we asked participants in our studies was questions like, does this ad feel like a good fit for the product it's promoting? Or something feels off about the ad. So it was more about the sort of holistic sense that people got about the ad and the messaging.
What were I'm assuming the way these work is you show people one of two or several ads about the same thing, one of which highlights the science, others of which do not. And so what kind of comparison conditions are there? Like if it's not showcasing the science that went into developing this product, how else could you pitch a product like that?
So in our studies, the control conditions usually just essentially eliminated the word scientifically developed. So it's not that they said it was developed using something else. It just didn't have that scientific development phrase in there. We did have one study where we looked at if we described the product as being rigorously developed. We didn't use the word science, but we still sort of alluded to a development process that was in some way rigorous, even if not scientific. Would that be sufficient to get, a backfiring? And it did not seem to be the case. So when the, hedonic body wash, I think was what we used, or sort of a sensual body wash was described as being rigorously developed, people were okay with that because it didn't trigger the cold, sterile, science-y thoughts that were presumably triggered when they learned about the rigorous scientific developed body wash.
I'm realizing that I had my sort of sense of these studies was a little off, and that I thought it was more about like just that people don't want these products to be scientifically developed, whereas it seems like this is mostly about like the ad. Like, do you get the sense that people might say like, I don't care that you use science, but like, don't focus on it in your ad. Like that doesn't feel like the right strategy. Or is it that they're saying like, Get the science out of the chocolate factory.
I think that I think that it's probably more the latter. I don't think that they have as nuanced an understanding of like, it's fine to, put the science there, but just don't mention it in the ad. I'd rather not hear about it. I don't think that level of sort of sophisticated thinking is necessarily what's going on. I mean, what's interesting is that I think part of why these ads feel so weird to people is because they lack an understanding of why science is necessary for a lot of products. So when it comes to things like a chocolate chip cookie, science is actually quite important because baking is really a science. It's chemistry. And if you put the wrong number of teaspoons of baking soda into your cookie, or you skip the flour or skip the sugar, the product that you're going to end up with is going to be completely different and possibly horrible tasting. So chemistry is necessary for baking, but I don't think people realize that, or sort of put those two factors together. And so in one of our studies, we gave participants an article where they had to read about how baking is essentially chemistry. And when they learned about how baking is chemistry, now they didn't mind the ad. So I don't think it's just an objection to the ad. I think it was an objection to the idea of cookies being made with science. But when they were sort of educated about why you kind of need science to make cookies, well, now an ad that talks about how these cookies were scientifically developed feels okay, because it's like, well, yeah, of course it was scientifically developed. That's actually a good thing. It means that, it's going to have the proper proportions of ingredients in it.
That's what I was wondering about the comparison conditions, because I was like, well, if not science, what do people want the process to be? Like, how else do you develop a cookie? You just want to throw ingredients in a bowl 600 times and pick your favorite? So, that's what I wonder. Like, is there any sense that people are saying, well, the more optimal way to create indulgent products is something else? That reminded me of the Great British Bake Off, and every season of that show, there's someone on there who on the first episode talks about how they're a scientist or an engineer, and I like to bring my science mind to my baking. And every season when that person shows up, my wife and I go, they're going home, because they never make it as far. And there's a little feeling of like, I almost would have been that person who was like, well, yeah, of course, like you need science, baking is a science. But I'm almost now convinced that like, oh, like to be truly great is to kind of throw away the like over precision and have like the taste of someone who knows what they're doing. So that just made me wonder, like, is it that? Are people saying like, oh, to make the best Cadbury product, to make the best soap is to just like have an artisan who knows what they're doing, just sort of wave their wand and create the product that's perfect? Or maybe that's just not a side of the equation you know as much about.
I don't know for sure what they're thinking is the alternative. And I don't know that they are necessarily thinking through, well, hold on a second, if we get rid of the science, what is the process here? I do think there is some work on sort of like wanting to keep a magical element to creating certain types of products. And if you sort of learn about how the sausage gets made, that kind of eliminates some of that magic. And there's also some work looking at like love as being like, the missing ingredient. So maybe they think cookies should be made with love and magic, not science.
I suppose that's the case, and that's why Keebler has been so successful. That's their whole advertising strategy. So you mentioned a little bit like a way in which you were able to kind of reduce or eliminate this bias. Are there other ways in which you go like, this is just like, forget about it. Just don't put science in ads about indulgent products? Or are there cases where you'd go like, well, actually, it would be advantageous to still play up the science?
Well, one case is if you can sort of reposition whatever product you're talking about as being more functional rather than more indulgent. So if you can say this body wash or this lotion, it's not a sensual body wash or lotion. It's actually a really functional skin repairing body wash or lotion. And you can sort of play up the more practical element. That's where it would be better to talk about how it has been scientifically formulated to sort of achieve those attributes. So that was one study that we conducted where we found that if we could, even with the same product, just describe it in different ways, highlight different aspects of the product, now all of a sudden talking about the science behind it was great and worked better than not describing the science behind it. Another thing that we found was that not all people have the same reaction to these types of ads. And in particular, people who have a high degree of trust in science and people who themselves work in a science industry of some sort, they didn't show this same bias against scientifically developed products that are indulgent. Even people who just didn't endorse the idea that science is cold and sterile. If you don't see science as cold, then there's no problem because there's no mismatch between science and an indulgent product. So it's not the case that all people, no matter what, are going to experience this same aversion to scientifically formulated indulgent products. There are individual differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is helpful to know, because my read originally was like, what is the problem with science in these ads? Like, I would find this like a very captivating thing. The other example that I was
must trust scientists.
I think I do. But I've said it on this show before, but like America's Test Kitchen, I'm like I'm going to mess it up, but do I stan America's Test Kitchen? Is that how I use that terminology? Do we know? No? All right.
Did you say stan?
Stan, yeah.
Oh, yes. If you love it, I think stan just means like you're a fan.
You gave me, you were giving me nothing and leaving me out to dry as I was like looking for any hope that I had said that right. But
unfortunately, I'm just not quite Gen Z enough to really speak with confidence on this topic.
Anyhow, point is, America's Test Kitchen is incredible. And their whole premise is like we rigorously test every recipe so many times. Like we go through like 80 iterations of every recipe before we publish it. And they're like doing blind taste tests of all these different things. And I'm like, that is incredible. But technically, to your point, it sort of is a mismatch of like, I'm just looking for a stew. Like I'm looking for a warm stew and you're trying to muck it up with your tests and your diagnostics. Which again comes back to the like, is it that people don't think science is a viable way to achieve like optimal indulgence, or just that they like don't like when those things are paired together in advertisements?
I think they just don't like when it's. I think it's that they don't like when it's paired together. Period. I don't think it's just about advertisements. I think if you get them to think deeply about it and say, well, hey, hold on a second, how else are we supposed to decide if this is good or not? Then maybe they might come around, or maybe they'd be able to articulate, a logical objection to it. But I don't think it's a very thoughtful process necessarily. I think this is more so, I mean, I don't have evidence necessarily to speak to this, but my inclination is that it's a little bit more of a gut feeling, less of a, well thought out, I don't think this is the best way of producing food. And I think that this other method would be much better. I don't think that sort of degree of thinking through is happening.
So in general, the takeaways from this are not, they highlight that people have this mixed relationship with science and when and how it's used. But at least, get your science out of my chocolate is not, the most distressing societal trend that related to science. And so if we move a little bit further from that and get back to the question of like anti-science views in general, what are like, if you were to sort of give a broad level idea of like what's going on, that there would be sort of movements that are, I don't know, antagonistic to science or dismissive of science, like what's going on in terms of like why people would try to distance themselves from what the scientific establishment is trying to tell them?
I mean, I definitely agree with you that being, anti-climate scientist is probably a little bit worse than being anti-chocolate scientist.
Both bad. But.
Both bad. We need to address these issues. But I think, if you look at public polling, there does seem to be a rise in sort of a general distrust of scientists, as well as a lot of other institutions. If you can think of science as almost an institution in and of itself, which I think a lot of people maybe think of it that way. And certainly a lot of scientists work for institutions like governments and universities. And there's an increase in distrust of government as well. And so I think these distrusts feed on one another. And if scientists are highly associated with institutions that aren't trusted, then I think some of that distrust bleeds out onto them.
In terms of kind of work that you've done to sort of bring together like multiple arguments for why there would be this kind of societal level distrust. What's interesting is that, it's not surprising, but interesting that it's a persuasion approach to the question, which feels perfectly natural. But as you argue, like, isn't the dominant way that people have been talking about anti-science views in general, right? So I'm curious, like, what is the value of thinking of anti-science views from the lens of persuasion, and why might not that have been the dominant way of doing so?
Well, I think that what's valuable about it is that it helps point to potential solutions. If you can think about, okay, using our understanding of the principles of attitudes and persuasions and opinion science, as it were, how can we understand this current phenomenon of anti-science sentiments? And how can we look at different theories that have been tested, tried and true over decades and decades of research? How can we apply our understanding of that to this new context? And persuasion research often looks at how we can change people's attitudes, change people's minds. That's very valuable when you're dealing with an issue of people, let's say, having opinions or beliefs that are harmful or inaccurate. Understanding how to move the needle, how to move those opinions is very valuable from a societal perspective. Why has it not been thought of in those ways before? I think I wouldn't claim to be the first person to think about anti-science sentiments from a persuasion perspective. And I certainly think that a lot of the research that we cited in that paper looked at different aspects of anti-science sentiment from a persuasion perspective. So there was existing research that looked at, source characteristics when it came to scientists, or looked at cognitive dissonance theory in relation to different scientific theories. I think putting it all together through the lens of here's sort of a comprehensive take on how persuasion can help us understand anti-science across domains. That was what was maybe a little bit more novel about this paper. I think oftentimes people research specific types of anti-science sentiment. So they might research climate change denial or the anti-vax movement. And it's important to look at those things specifically because there are really specific considerations that you have to think about when you're thinking about climate change denial that maybe don't apply to other types of anti-science sentiment. But sometimes it can be valuable to look at, well, what are common trends across all of these types of anti-science sentiments that we can apply across different domains, and that can help us understand a more general view of why people are anti-science.
It seems too that like the one lesson is just that like, well, where are people's feelings about science coming from? It's just a case of people getting messages from people, or at least some large proportion of like what I think about science and what it means to me is me as a person having received messages from other people, some of which have landed and shaped my views, others of which I've fought off and said, no, thank you, I'm not going to take it. And if you boil it down to a process like that, all of a sudden it opens up new doors for being like, oh, well, what do we know about how messages do what they do from the people they come from to the people they reach? And so you outline 4 general kind of factors that matter. And I wonder if it's useful just to sort of summarize, like, if you study persuasion, you know, who says what to whom as a mantra. These 4 factors make a lot of sense as to where people's anti-science views might come from and why they might be hard to change.
Yes, and if you are yourself a persuasion researcher or a big fan of persuasion research, these 4 factors are certainly going to sound familiar. The first one looks at the source of the scientific message. So the scientist or the journalist or the teacher that is communicating the message to you. And if you see that source as not actually being the expert they claim they are, or being kind of untrustworthy and sketchy, or being really biased in a particular direction, then you're not going to see that source as very credible, and you're not going to be particularly persuaded by what they have to say. Reason number 2 that we outline is all about identity and whether you identify with a group that is themselves anti-science. So if you're part of a community where everyone kind of rejects science, or everyone is saying, that vaccine isn't to be trusted, it's going to be hard to be the black sheep of that community. And there are legitimate reasons why a community might distrust science. There are historic examples and current examples of scientists going into communities, particularly Black communities, Indigenous communities, and conducting experiments on vulnerable populations and either just buggering off and those communities never see the benefits, or in fact being actively harmed by the scientific experiment that was conducted. And so there's legitimate reasons that a community might feel like, whoa, I don't want to hear anything that this scientist has to say. I don't know where they're coming from here. The third reason that we identify is that people's existing attitudes and opinions and beliefs may kind of be at odds with what the science is saying. And sometimes science has bad news to tell us and tells us things that we don't want to hear, like, hey, if you don't want to hurt your grandma, you have to not see her for 6 months. That's a tough pill to swallow. And sometimes when there are tough pills to swallow, people just refuse to swallow them at all and double down on their existing beliefs and opinions rather than compromising or rejigging what they think about the world. The fourth reason that we talk about in the paper is that how the message is communicated matters just as much as what the message is itself. And sometimes messages are communicated in ways that are, again, at odds with how people tend to think about things. So one example is that some people really can't tolerate any type of ambiguity or uncertainty This is referred to as need for closure, need for cognitive closure. And so those people want things to be sort of black and white, cut and dry, rather than sort of, fuzzy or wishy-washy. The problem is that science is often communicated in kind of uncertain terms, or maybe even sort of wishy-washy terms. Scientists will say things like, our evidence suggests that there could be an effect of blah-blah-blah on blah-blah-blah. And if you really like things to be cut and dry, hearing that something might have a suggestive effect, potentially, maybe, but we're not sure, that can feel like, well, these scientists don't have any idea what they're talking about. And so figuring out a way to communicate uncertainty or find some sort of common language that maybe fits a little bit better with how people think about things would probably serve scientists for addressing that issue.
Yeah, so that the last thing you said sort of leads into the next phase of things, which is like, if we can understand like the key dimensions that might be driving anti-science sentiments, do they give us any clues to like what we could do going forward? And so tangibly, does anything occur to you as like, one promising thing that you could do when talking about science is to whatever, as a way of bridging that divide?
I think that absolutely understanding where people are coming from and why they're experiencing any type of resistance or rejection of science is the key to knowing what to do and how to move forward. And there are, I think, solutions that arise from each of these different reasons for anti-science sentiment that we talk about in the paper as well. But just briefly, I'll touch on a couple of examples. So for people who distrust scientists, that's an example where acknowledging the reasons why someone might be rejecting of science in the first place, and giving what is referred to as a two-sided message, where you say, on the one hand, I understand why you're resistant to this. However, this is why scientists are still making this recommendation. It's not a position of false neutrality where you're saying everyone is equally right about everything. You're still landing firmly on the side that is supported by science. But you're acknowledging, throwing them a bone and saying, hey, I get why this is frustrating. I get why you want to see your grandmother. But if you want to protect her, you have to avoid her right now during this time. For the identity reasons for rejecting science, for people who identify with a group that is anti-science, let's say, one stream of research that seems to be somewhat promising is finding some sort of superordinate identity, so a shared identity, a shared goal that you can appeal to when trying to talk to someone that maybe disagrees with you. An example that I often give is, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you disagree with your uncle about climate change, let's say, rather than just, simply dismissing him out of hand, maybe try to find what is our common identity here. How can I appeal to that and use that to kind of find a common ground and have a conversation about this? When it comes to rejecting science because you already have an attitude or opinion that is misaligned with the facts on the ground that science is sort of presenting you with, that could be really uncomfortable. And this is an area where there's been lots of research of how we can kind of help people manage that discomfort, be it doing self-affirmation. So talking about, what do I care about as a person? What are my values as a person? And how can that help me get over some of this discomfort? And this is more of a preventative strategy, but education can be a valuable tool for helping people maybe have sort of correct opinions in the first place, so that when science comes along and tells you, hey, this is the earth is round. You are already on board with that. And so there's nothing uncomfortable about hearing that for you. And then finally, in terms of how science is communicated, to go back to the example of people who can't handle ambiguity or who have a low tolerance for ambiguity. That's a tricky one because science is ambiguous. And I wouldn't want to recommend that scientists suddenly start using really certain language all the time, especially because then that could maybe have some long-term consequences for trust when they inevitably have to sometimes change their recommendations because science is constantly evolving. But I think that sometimes scientists can maybe go too far in the opposite direction when communicating with the public. So if there's something that you do know to be true, or there is so much compelling evidence for that you can talk about it in a little bit more certain terms, I think that could be helpful. I also think that educating people about how science is constantly evolving and to not see, scientists switching positions as a sign of they don't know what they're talking about, but instead a sign of this is actually how science is supposed to work. This is actually science firing out of all pistons.
I always wonder on the last point, because I've wondered that too, like how do you get around this of uncertainty aversion? Because it's just inherent to the process. But I always wonder if it makes sense to frame conclusions as like, as best we can tell right now, this is what's going on, right? Because that does reflect kind of how it works, where you're not going to say you found something. If you truly are like, who knows? I don't know if it's true or not. You do. Like you're making a conclusion. You're making a claim. Even if you want to be like, on the fence about it before you make it like, this is absolutely forever true. But we do think it's like pretty probably true, or I wouldn't be talking about it. But yeah, that idea that like preparing people for the potential for this to change, but still have the confidence to say that like, based on what I know right now, this seems to be the case. I always wonder if that would help address this problem without sacrificing the values of science.
Yeah. Or even saying something like, here's what we found. And then you can talk about what you found. And that doesn't mean that what you found is always and forever true. But you can say with certainty that that is what you found, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that future research couldn't, overturn it or find a really important, caveat to what you found.
Is there evidence that we have from like science journalism or whatever that shows that there's a lot of uncertainty in this kind of rhetoric? Like I buy that like probably scientists express uncertainty, but I also know that plenty of scientists are not averse to expressing certainty. And in terms of like how widespread is this as like a reason why people go, I don't know what to do with science. I'm curious if you found anything that shows that like, yes, commonly science is expressed in a lot of uncertainty that people find aversive.
I don't know if there's ever been like a linguistic analysis of how scientists talk about science and looking at the degree of uncertainty. That would be an interesting thing to look at. But I think there definitely are a lot of examples of scientific recommendations changing. And so that happens regardless of how scientists initially talk about their science. We could talk about in the pandemic, the recommendation to wear masks that was then, initially the recommendation was not to wear masks. And then the recommendation shifted to actually, never mind, the science has shown us that you should wear masks. Whoops, we were wrong. There are other examples beyond the pandemic of things like the Canada Health Guide used to include fruit juice as an example of a healthy food that you should consume to get a source of fruits or vegetables. Now they no longer recommend fruit juice. That might be maybe a little bit more of an innocuous example, but science changes and recommendations and guidelines change, and that's just something that's going to happen. And I think people need to accept that a little bit more. And there needs to be better education about how scientific recommendations are going to shift. And that doesn't mean that they were wrong before, but maybe that they were operating on slightly incomplete evidence. And now that we have new studies, we can say that it's actually a little different than what we thought it was before.
There's a 1 minute moment of the Drew Carey show from 20 years ago that still won't leave my memory, which is he's lamenting the news, going back and forth on whether eggs are good for you or not. And he's like, one day they're good for you, one day they're bad for you, and then they're good for you again. No, they're not good for you again. They were always good for you. And so I agree, like that's, to me, more of the conundrum than scientists expressing uncertainty, because almost the solution is for scientists to express more uncertainty, right? Like the whiplash of changes come from the perception that the scientists knew what they were talking about the first time, whereas to express uncertainty would like prepare people for that inevitability that like this is going to change a little bit later. And that's the pandemic example is great because it's like, if we could say like, based on what we know now, this is the way to go. But like, let me just say that might be different later, because that's how science works. And so, yeah, I just wonder how much stock to put in this like uncertainty versus fluctuation. Like, what's the root cause of people's tenuous relationship with science?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that even I, thinking right now, like in this moment, I think that I'm doing all the things that are best. I think that I'm doing all the things that are most supported by the evidence, and I generally try to live my life in that way in terms of, like the foods I consume and the various products that I use, and the hours of sleep that I sleep. I try to think of like, okay, what does the research say? And I'll try my best to kind of abide by that. And in my mind, I'm following the best practices and that it's probably all going to be true. But that's naive. And it's at least some of what I'm doing, I'm going to at some point find out was wrong. And I think, and then, I'll adjust my behavior from there. But I think even for someone who studies this and thinks about it a lot, it's a little bit hard to accept that what you're doing and the choices that you're making and the choices that feel really important might be wrong and might be overturned by the evidence. And you might find out that you're doing the exact opposite of what you should have been doing this whole time. I agree with that there's this tension between uncertainty and fluctuation. I don't know what the right answer is in terms of whether if scientists just said, this is what the recommendation is, but don't hold me to it. I think that would probably not work either, because I think even people who are relatively comfortable with ambiguity would probably be like, oh boy, now I really don't know what to do. And because you have to make a choice for everything. Like you have to make a choice of whether to leave your house wearing a mask or not. You have to make a choice of whether to get a certain vaccine or not. And so being told, I think you should get this vaccine, but who knows, don't quote me. Well, then you're like, well, what should I do?
Yeah, that feels like a very legalese way of presenting science of like, okay, here are the parameters of my suggestion. Yeah. and even in your example where you go like, well, I'm going to find out that some of what I'm doing is wrong. There are still two ways to react to that, right? One is to go like, well, thank goodness we have science to have corrected itself. And like, I remain a scientifically minded person. Or you go, what are you talking about? You told me that this was good. The whole establishment, like, what good is it if it can't tell me what the right answer is? And so that does kind of come down to, I think, what you're saying, what you summarized about need for closure or like these individual differences, where some people are just like cool with it. They're like, I'm happy to go with the flow and ride the wave of science. And others are just like, listen, I need you to have answers for me. And if you don't have those, I'm not going to board the ship anymore.
Yeah, and I think people have different expectations of what they want out of science and what they think they're going to get out of science. And some people, of course, don't trust scientists, but I think some people maybe have almost like an inflated idea of what science can do for them. But then it's really disappointing when it doesn't achieve those goals. So if you think that science is going to tell you like the answer for how to live your best life and optimize all of your wellness and live to 104, and then studies are inconclusive or based on shaky data, that can kind of rock your world a little bit because maybe you were expecting science to be able to sort of give you the answer, and it can't give you the answer.
And it's a dangerous way that we present science sometimes too, because it is sort of this like the ultimate way of knowing things is to use this method, which makes it seem like this is the way we get to the truth, capital T truth. But that promise is just misleading if you interpret that as
and now all of a sudden we're getting into like to religiosity domain. You know, if you're expecting science to be your God, you're going to be disappointed. There is some work that has been done looking at like blind faith in science and how that's bad too. If you just think that all scientists are always going to be right and have too much blind faith in science, then you end up being more susceptible to misinformation if something's sort of like gussied up under the guise of science. You're going to fall for it.
Such as Cadbury saying that we use science to make our delicious eggs. And so just trust us, go with us, buy us over others.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. I think that in general, the scientific method is kind of goes against the idea of blind faith, but people don't always know that or recognize that.
So by way of wrapping this up, are there sort of new directions that you're taking this? What's on the path now on your end?
Yeah, so one project that I'm working on right now is looking at what are the factors in communication that actually make people trust scientists more, and what are ways that we can describe the scientists behind products that make people more interested in them. So it's still within the domain of sort of consumer research, but it's looking at how the creators behind the scientists can maybe help people get a little bit more on board. And so it comes back to what we've been talking about regarding science communication and how the scientists behind the brands and behind the products can talk about them and can talk about themselves and their process to get consumers a little bit more on board.
And in addition to research work, you're doing your own science communication yourself. Where did the impetus to start doing, like, what's the through line? Marketing generally, right? Like dissecting marketing on YouTube.
I think I usually open most videos saying that the channel is about talking about the marketing behind the stuff you encounter every day.
And so why do this? why spend?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I ask myself that as well, especially when I'm like, oh, I've got to make more content, but I also have a revision that's due. So I honestly can't even totally remember why I thought of it exactly, but at some point a few months ago, I thought that it would be something that would be, I think, fun to do. And also a good way of connecting with maybe a little bit of a different audience than who I might typically connect with. The scientific articles or academic articles that are the bread and butter of academia are read by a really specific group of people that are already really interested in those topics and paid to be interested in those topics. And my students are a different population that I talk to in my class. But even beyond people who are enrolled in an undergraduate business program, there are other people who might be interested in marketing, and especially in, maybe not the nuts and bolts that are required for their job of how to market something, but maybe just sort of a general interest in, hey, I've noticed that people tend to not meet their resolutions that they make at New Year's. Why is that? And so talking about things that I hope have sort of a general interest to people, beyond just, I'm learning this because it's important for my class, or I'm reading this article because, I'm a researcher who studies this.
Yeah, that's great. I'll put a link to the YouTube channel in the notes for this episode. How you've done? How many? 4 or 5 or so?
Yeah, not that many. Just a small handful of videos. Yeah,
you're figuring out how to please the YouTube algorithm. it's own nut to crack.
Which is, I have not yet cracked it, but I'll keep working away at it.
Well, that's what they say. Just pump out just loads of stuff. That's the content creation game.
Yeah. I'll just start doing weekly vlogs and makeup tutorials, just whatever I can think of.
We're at a real professional turning point for you.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk about this stuff. It was great to catch up.
Yeah, really nice catching up as well.
Alrighty, that'll do it for another episode of Opinion Science. Thank you so much to Aviva Philipp-Muller for taking the time to talk about her work. As always, a link to her website and the research we talked about is on the episode webpage. You'll also find a link to her new YouTube channel. For what it's worth, the opening bit about the science lecture circuit in the US is a topic that I've been interested in ever since I ran across this cool old handbill advertisement for a lecture series called Nights with Science at the Wilson Avenue Baptist Church in Willoughby, Ohio in 1863. Professor W.C. Richards promised to do experiments like the bottomless jar, volcano from ice, spectroscopic illustrations, and the swarm of iron bees. The price of attendance? 35 cents. That led me to a book by Diarmaid Finnegan at Queen's University Belfast called The Voice of Science, British Scientists on the Lecture Circuit in Gilded Age America, which is what I drew most on to write that intro. Anyhow, for more about this show, head to opinionsciencepodcast.com and follow the show wherever you like to follow podcasts. And hey, maybe it's time you leave a review of the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to do such things. I'm proud to have retained a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts over the last 4 years of doing Opinion Science. And, it's always nice to have more kind voices adding to those. It helps new people find the show. Okay, that's it for me. The semester is over, and it feels so sweet. I'm looking forward to seeing you, though, back in a couple weeks for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.